Today, I'm going to do a quick video on something I've thought about a lot, which is what makes a great documentary interview location. And I have done hundreds and hundreds of documentary interviews, and making sure that you are thinking through these 9 items is incredibly important. If you're making a documentary or a branded content piece, then an interview will be a large part of that process. So if you don't have the correct setup and haven't thought about these items, then you could be in a world of hurt. All right, so let's go through the 9 parameters that I'm always thinking about when looking for a great interview location. And stick around to the end when I can tell you you can throw any of them out. This video is brought to you by Shhhhh. If you're new here, my name is Kern Sheldon, and I'm an ASC award-winning cinematographer and Oscar-nominated filmmaker. Now, as a documentary cinematographer, I have set up hundreds of interviews, but I never found the process all that easy. But with processes like the one I'm talking about today and my own 10 steps of cinematic interviews, which I've made into my first ever online course, I have continually improved this part of my cinematography. And so if you want to also improve your documentary setups, then check out the link to my course below and use the code KERNYouTube for 30% off. It might be painful to hear for cinematographers out there, but the number one most important thing to think about when you're choosing a documentary interview location is sound. And the reason for this is because audio is the story. If you are doing an interview, then that person's probably retelling a story that you're going to overlay B-roll or archival or a recreation on top of, and therefore the audio from that interview is the most important part of the film. If you don't have great audio and you can't hear the story clearly, then the viewer is going to check out no matter how beautiful the interview looks. Every time I'm looking for a documentary interview location, I ask, where's the quietest place you have? And if there are a variety of options, then I can start thinking about the different visual elements in each one. But the number one most important thing to think about is audio. Where is someplace that is quiet and that you can control the sound? The second thing I think about is natural light. Does a location have solid, nice, natural light? Now, if you are doing an interview in a studio setting, then this doesn't pertain to you, but most documentary interviews are done in the fields. And therefore, having a location that has nice natural light can really enhance your visuals. So what does this mean in practice? Mostly it's just using the windows in the space effectively. So depending on where the sun is, and you get a Sunseeker app to make sure that the sun doesn't drastically change while you're doing the interview, you can have nice diffuse light coming through a window, or even have a splash of light on the back wall to add some visual interest. So being able to use the natural light to your advantage can greatly enhance your documentary interview location. With that being said, sometimes too much natural light, too much sunlight can really screw up an interview over the course of a couple hours. And so number 3 is having control over your environment. And this pertains both to sound and light. So control means either blacking out a window or just being able to make sure that there aren't other people walking through the space. On the shoot I'm on right now, it's a branded content piece for Marriott International, and I'm in a lot of really nice hotels. So you'd think, well, it's really easy to find a great interview location. The problem is it's a working hotel and there are tons of guests and people and conferences and weddings and all sorts of things going on. And so there are actually very few spaces where you can control the environment. There was a hotel I was just at in Mumbai that had a beautiful conference area, but unfortunately, if we set up an interview there, it would be a sound nightmare and people would be walking through the shot all the time. So make sure you have control over the environment. So we have a location that has nice natural light, is quiet, and we can control the entire environment. Now we can actually start thinking about how we want our interview to look. So the next thing I think about is, where is the visual depth? If I have a small conference room or a tight confined space, then it's pretty difficult to get a nice looking interview. I'm currently in a small hotel room and using a 20mm lens, which is a bit of an artistic choice for an interview, works fine for YouTube. But in general, I like to shoot a lot of my interviews at 35 to 50mm as my A cam, and then a tighter 85mm as a B cam. And so I would love to find a place with a lot of visual depth. So what does visual depth and interest mean? Well, mostly that you have a lot of space behind your subject so you can separate your subject from the background. So the further the background is away, the more they'll pop off the screen. But also looking for naturally occurring elements that draw your eye to the interviewee themselves. A lot of people just throw their lens at an f1.4 and blow out the background, but instead I like to look for lines that lead the eye to the actual interviewee. So that could be a row of tables, it could be a bookshelf, it could be anything that just makes them stand out a little bit more. Now, if you also have visual depth, that also gives you the opportunity to add a hair light to make them pop off the background a little bit more. Similar to visual depth and interest, you also want to look for non-distracting backgrounds. You don't want your backgrounds to be too messy and draw the eye of the viewer away from what you want them to focus on, which is the interviewee. So what does it mean to look for distracting elements? That can be anything from a giant air conditioning vent on the ceiling, exit signs, clocks that are blinking, all these different things that are in a lot of rooms, and you'll probably come in contact with them, and you need to look out for and avoid with your A cam and B cam. It's also useful to have a couple different colored tapes for things like clocks, especially on ovens or microwaves that might find themselves in the background. Otherwise, watch out for shiny or reflective surfaces, anything that makes the background brighter than the interviewee itself. Quick break from talking about great interview locations to talk about today's sponsor, Shhhhh. Now, if you've watched this channel for any length of time or seen any of my interview setup videos, any of my lighting tutorials, any video pretty much where I talk about anything that has to do with documentary lighting, then you've seen that I love and use Shhhhh products. And I love Shhhhh lights because they're incredibly portable, affordable, and also pack a huge amount of power for their size and weight and price. The first light I ever got from Shhhhh was their X100, a tiny light that packs 100 watts of power, but since then they have branched out into creating even more powerful and portable lights. The G200 and G300 are my two current favorite lights that they make, but they also have put out the B300 and B500, a 300 watt and a 500 watt light that is an all-in-one package. So check out Shhhhh lights, they're my personal favorite, and use the code in the description below for 10% off your Shhhhh order. All right, let's get back to finding some great interview locations. The next thing I think about is whether the location adds context to the story itself. For example, if you watch something like Chef's Table on Netflix, they're usually not interviewing them in their living room. They're in a kitchen or they're in a restaurant to add context to the story. No matter what your story is, there's something that contextually makes sense. If you're filming a craftsman or a carpenter, then actually filming them in their studio itself adds context to the interview. A lot of what we talked about so far focuses on the story of the actual documentary or branded content piece that you're creating, but there are also some very technical and just practical things that you need to think about when finding a great documentary interview location. So one of the most important things to think about in this regard is having enough actual physical space to do everything you need to do to set up the interview. If you have a key light, a kicker, 2 cameras, an interviewer, and 2 people manning those cameras, you're going to need quite a bit of space to actually set all that gear up. And so yes, you want that visual depth, you want that visual interest, but also making sure you have enough physical space to conduct the interview itself. Along those same lines, having a space that has enough power to actually power all of the things you need to power to do an interview. You might have 2, 3 lights, a couple cameras, being able to have a couple extension cords and actually reach different outlets to power all of those items for a couple hours to actually do the interview is important. And finally, look for a space that is comfortable for everyone involved, and especially the interviewee and the subject. And that can be very basic stuff like it's not too hot, it's not too cold, they're not sweaty, but it can also be that they feel safe enough to talk about the story that you're trying to tell. And often that is just in their own home or in a location that they are comfortable with. I think a lot of people will rent a really nice looking space and bring a subject to that space, and that's fine depending on the subject matter, but always check in with your subject and see where they would be most comfortable to actually do the interview. Because if they're uncomfortable and they don't want to be vulnerable and share, then your story is going to take a hit. So if any of these elements detract from that specific goal to tell a great story, then you need to shift and find something that does work. So there you go, 9 parameters I always think about when trying to find a great documentary interview location. But like any documentary or anything on film, sometimes when you find yourself in a certain context, you can throw any of these out. For a interviewee and a documentary story, things are always shifting, and perhaps having a really cluttered background works perfect for your story, or having a cramped space and no visual depth works for your story. All right, so let me know in the comments below if there are any other things that you think about when you're trying to find a great documentary interview location. And if you want to improve your own documentary interview setups, check out my course, The 10 Steps to Cinematic Interviews, in the description below, and use the code CURRENYouTube for 30% off. I'll see you over there.